Welcome to my number 2 of my trifecta of my debate of the weeks. This one, if you see the title below, if I'm correct, I'm going to use this title. What if there was no Vince? And I'm talking about Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And this is a junior one. This is one that we know that built the WWF into the WWF, into the WWE, and to what we have right now. What happened if Vincent Kennedy McMahon did not build his franchise from his father? Let's kind of do a little bit of back history. Vincent J. McMahon, Vince Sr., if I believe I'm remembering his middle name right, he ran WWF in May. He was part of the National Wrestling Alliance. Essentially when all the different states had their own regional promotions, and he was a part of that group that was from the National Wrestling Alliance and the AWA and the WCCW and the WW, I think I can't remember them all. There was a lot of them out there. There was at least 20 to 30 different promotions back in the 70s and the early 80s before the regional thing dropped and was reconstructed later. But Vince Sr. allowed Vince Jr., the one we know, to take the company that he was running. And he said, you pay me back. And this is what Vincent Kennedy McMahon said himself. If you pay me back all the money from that promotion, it's all yours. If I'm remembering correctly. Well, Vince ran the company. He managed to build enough money to give the money to his father. And he took total ownership of the company. And from there, he decided to go head-to-head with all the different companies. Florida Championship Wrestling, WCCW, WCW, ECW, which was known as Eastern Championship Wrestling before it became Extreme Championship Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling. The only one I believe he didn't really fully compete with was Stampede Wrestling. Since that was in Canada, he never really bothered it. It was in a different area. It was something he didn't really touch. But he literally went up against all the other regional companies, and he took not only the talent, he took their writers, he took a lot of the people who were former wrestlers who became managers. He literally took all the business. And by the 1980s, middle 1980s to the late 1980s, almost all of the major promotions, which didn't just go under because of bad management, they got wiped out because the WWF took their business. When cable came around, and I was born around the time before cable, when it was still being developed, I am a pretty old guy, even though I look incredibly young and glamorous. I can't believe I said glamorous. But back in the 80s, when cable was just coming out, that was the gateway for everyone to see things that they wouldn't normally see. Regional promotions usually did local television. When cable came out, most of them tried to go on cable. But Vince was smart enough to get cable before anyone else and went from one region to another, getting cable from New York all the way across, from Maine going all the way across most of the country. He was the one who managed to set everything up for WrestleMania. But think about this. What happened if Vince had never existed? Or Vince did not decide to try and make a regional promotion into a titan that we know the remnants of today, because it's not the same as it was back in the 90s into the 2000s. It is a shell of his former self, but it's still a monster. But what happened if he didn't exist? What happened if the WWF didn't change into the WWF, didn't change into the WWE? Well, this is what I thought would happen. Let's say Vince did take his father's company. Let's say he took over it and he promised to pay him back because he wanted to buy it. But let's say he didn't. Let's say that he could not repay his father for the company, and his father basically said, you're not getting the company, but you're allowed to work in there as a promoter. No, as a manager. I'm still the major promoter. I will still own it. And then when Vince Sr. died, someone else took it over. Let's say Pat Patterson took over the company, but Vince could not take it away from him. This is what I believe would have happened. This is just my belief. You guys can tell me below. We know by the middle of the 1980s, like the video game crash in the 1980s, what happened with Atari, basically wrestling went for a crash. Basically, the interest of wrestling dropped dramatically around the time when the Four Horsemen came around, when basically Ric Flair came out. A lot of promotions took a big hit around that time. But that was also due to the fact that Vince had managed to get a huge share of the business. Now, if that didn't happen, I do believe WCCW, which is World Class Championship Wrestling, that would have been the one that would have had the most strength to actually do something, which would have turned into WCW. I really do believe if there was no WWE, that WCW would have been the premier company that we'll be talking about today. I also believe that ECW would have also stayed alive, because when it came down to it, one of the reasons why ECW, I'm not saying that it was not bad management by Paul Heyman. Let's be honest, he did manage the place badly. But one of the reasons why he lost was because most of his talent went to WWE. And some went to WCW. But what happened with, Shane Douglas, sorry, I'm saying Shane Douglas. Shane Douglas, what he did back in around 1994, threw away the National Wrestling Alliance belt and used the ECW title as his platform, would have made a huge change, because at the time, National Wrestling Alliance was affiliated with WCW. It was a part of it. So essentially speaking, by breaking away from that, the National Wrestling Alliance would have only had WCW as the most strongest company there. And also National Wrestling Alliance, I would have believed, would have faded away. Like the AWA would have faded away. So it would have been WCW and ECW as the dominant shows, because that's all we ever talk about. We still talk about WCW, we still talk about ECW. And I really believe those would have been the two strongest companies that would have survived after the semi-crash of wrestling, the wrestling business. Now, would there be a third company? My guess is there would not be a TNA, because WCW would have never gone under. I do believe, though, that Georgia Championship Wrestling would have changed into something else. It was a very strong company before it lost a lot of its people to WWE and WCW and ECW, so they would stay around. A dark horse, I really believe, would have been Stampede Wrestling. Stampede Wrestling, I do believe, one of the reasons why it's never become really popular in the United States and was really seen countrywide or nationwide, was because the WWE really kind of dominated that. When it came to Stu Hart, he really could not compete with the WWE because Vince really overwhelmed it. But I really believe Stampede Wrestling would have also been a very strong factor. So my guess would be this: by now, 2015, there was never a WWE. If there was a WWF and there was no way to build it into what it is, we would have WCW still here, because I do believe Turner would have turned the company over to somebody else that would have been better. And I know there was several other places, that there was several other groups that was turned over to, like AOL, I believe, took over WCW at one point. Can't remember right now. But if it was other than AOL, I do believe that they would have succeeded and stayed in business, and they would be the dominant one. Second place would be ECW. If Paulie had been able to get another job, let's say another network, a good one. Maybe he took over where WWE would be, and that would be on USA. He would have been able to maintain the company. Yes, it would still be a narrow demographic, but it would probably still be strong enough that it would be useful. And I do believe the last two very weak ones would be Georgia Championship Wrestling and would be Stampede Wrestling. Now, I could say Florida Championship Wrestling. I could say the AWA, but I'm looking at it from a perspective where they were when things began to change. Now, the AWA, the NWA, they were really having problems. They were having problems at that time. And one of the things that was really helping them was because of Georgia Championship Wrestling was really sending a lot of people in to prop them up. That's just from what I understand. But this is just what I believe. What do you guys believe? Because I admit, I don't know everything, but I want to know your point of views. So I hope you enjoyed this second debate of the week out of the 3 that I'm going to produce. The next one will be about Hulk Hogan. And what would the WWE be without him? Have a good day and have a good night. Peace!